The next thing I want to talk about is Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is ZBrush's way of giving you virtual clay that is kind of topology independent. So what I mean by that is if we take a look at the poly frame for this object that we have here that we've been sculpting on that came originally from the Z-spheres, there is some kind of geometry associated with this, some kind of flow that came from the actual Z-spheres itself. And you can see everything's nice and evenly distributed. Okay, Dynamesh is going to be something that there's still going to be geometry to it, but it's not going to worry about if you did something like this. If we move a part of this model and really stretch it out, you see how we're really stretching these polygons out, and that would be a problem if we stepped up in the subdivision levels and then we try to sculpt on this. And let me put it on the standard brush, and if we start to sculpt on this, you can see how it's really kind of stretching those polygons, and it makes it to where this doesn't have the same look as this and through here. So that's a real problem when you're sculpting with the subdivision levels and you stretch out the model really far. Okay, so I'm going to step back like this real quick just to get it back here. And then I'm going to step up in my subdivision levels, just tapping D to do that. And I'm going to convert this on over to Dynamesh so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So if we go under the tool area and we go to geometry and open up Dynamesh, we can turn on Dynamesh. But I'm going to take this blur slider and push it down. And I'm going to take this resolution, I'm going to put it at 64 like this and hit Dynamesh. If there's subdivision levels on your model, it's going to ask you if you want to freeze the subdivision levels before hitting Dynamesh. I just usually always say no for that. And you can see here's the geometry that it created. It tries to remember something about the poly groups that are there, but this is the geometry that it creates. So it's not evenly divided into a grid like what we saw before, and you might be going, well, this doesn't look like good topology, so why would you want something like this? Basically, if we take this and we use the move brush like we did in the earlier example and just pull this thing out, and then we remesh using Dynamesh, so you hold down Control and drag in the open viewport and it'll regenerate the topology. You can see it's got an even distribution of polygons throughout the entire thing. Okay, so now whenever I sculpt on this, it's going to look the same. Sorry, I've got to put it on standard brush. It's going to look the same down here as it does up here. Now you might be going, well, the resolution on that doesn't look very good, so let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to hit undo till I get back to the point where I had my subdivision levels here like that, and we're just going to bump up this resolution. So we're going to take this up to 256. You can use the slider, so these numbers that I'm using, they don't really matter. You know, it could be something like this or whatever, but you just slide it up or you enter an exact number that you want and hit Dynamesh. It's asking if I want to freeze those subdivision levels, and you might notice the model doesn't really look that much different than what it looked before, but if we turn on the poly frame, you can see that it's made with this Dynamesh. So we're about at the same resolution as we were before. I'm going to hit undo. So you can see when we get in a little bit closer, you can see that there's finer wrinkles and cracks like that. So if you wanted to match that up, then we might have to go a little bit higher. So I'm going to go like 350 or so for the resolution and hit Dynamesh. And once it's done, we'll take a look. And that looks pretty good. But I don't want to get too high with this thing yet because you remember what I was saying earlier in the videos that you really should be sculpting in kind of stages. If we go right now and hold down Shift and start smoothing this thing out, you can see it doesn't really smooth all that great. It takes quite a bit of pen pressure and everything else to really kind of smooth that surface out. But if we go back and we got this resolution to something like 256 right around there. Let's actually 200. Let's do that. Dynamesh. And you can see the resolution drops a little bit. But if I hold down Shift, you can see it smooths a lot easier, right? And so at this beginning stages, I want to just worry about the shape, like what I talked about early in the earlier videos. And I want to be able to quickly move things around, smooth things out if I need to. And so this resolution should give me a good amount of detail, but then it's going to be easy enough to kind of manipulate the model. Okay, and so again, if I want to remesh, I'm going to hold down Control and drag a marquee in the open viewport, and then just let go of the pen, and it remeshes and redoes the topology on there. So you can see like that right there. But before I do that, I'm going to do a few things to the model, sculptural wise, to get it a little better standing. So maybe start to define out a little bit about the shoulders, where the shoulders might go. Maybe something about the trapezius muscles. Take this up in here, because the point of this video is to show you something about an organic surface, but then how do you take that organic surface and then combine it with things that look mechanical to kind of produce this cyborganic kind of feel to it. So a mixture of the two. And so right now at the beginning stages, the more important thing is not the cybernetic kind of parts to it, but more of the organic parts. So you can see how I'm just kind of, it's almost like drawing, just with this Dynamesh standard brush, just kind of roughing out where are these different landmarks that you're looking for. And I'm just kind of trying to outline maybe where some of these different muscle groups might sit, and just rough in that shape like this. And once you have this stuff roughed in, then we're going to go ahead and Dynamesh again, or remesh I should say. I'm going to make this brush size really large and then dig into this area to build up kind of a shelf right here. These are actually muscles go here and goes into the stomach. But doing this kind of, if you build this shape up, kind of gives you that whole comic book kind of look in through here, as far as the barrel chested kind of thing through the midsection. So I'm adding just a little bit more meat to that area. A little bit more here. So until you learn these forms, it's definitely good to get some anatomy reference books. I like to have pictures of bodybuilders, things like that. Anything that can help you understand the human form, especially these muscle structures if you're trying to do something like what I've got going on here, that's more of the proportions of like bodybuilder, action movie star kind of thing. Just getting that. And again, remember what we talked about as far as the only way that you're going to be able to know really kind of what's going on in 3D with what you're sculpting up. You have to lay down some of these strokes, and then you're going to have to spin the model and look at it from all different vantage points. And I'll show you here, whenever you remesh, one thing you got to keep in mind is with the Dynamesh, if you make surfaces run into each other, they don't have that gap in there anymore. Like when you remesh, it's going to combine those two things together. Just hitting undo. That brush was too large, so it was actually going through to the other side of the model. But what is cool through this process, so you can see I'm using the clay tubes, and it's just like I'm, building up some virtual clay. And then whenever I remesh through this process, I'm just going to hold down Control and drag in the open viewport. This becomes new real geometry to sculpt on. So just by using the brushes alone, it's like you are adding or subtracting away clay like you would in the real world. And so I'll use the move brush and keep tweaking on the shape a bit, like this. And here's where I have to really start to do something with this head, if you want to call it that. Just looks like a big blob of nothingness yet. So I really got to start kind of thinking about what it is that you want to create and making sure those proportions are actually working with the rest of the body. Also, here's where the inflate brush could actually help out. So if I wanted to pump up the volume of these arms, just use the inflate brush and then remesh like this. Maybe this is not enough here in the shoulders. So it's like, imagine if you're working this character out, you're just actually, instead of taking months of time to build up this muscle, you just kind of use the inflate brush and give it that mass really quickly. So I'm just holding down Control and drag it in there. And you can see I'm starting to get something that is looking a little more natural. Still needs some work, obviously, but can really start to define these shapes out. And also we've got muscle that runs from here up into here. And this, you can see this kind of divides like that. And then I'll put it on the move brush. I'm just tapping 4. You remember we made hotkeys for this, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So I'm just putting on the move brush and then checking this, trying to pull out the shape of that chest muscle a little bit better. And then just fixing any kind of like really weird lumpiness that I might have with some of these shapes. So I could keep going on and on with this, but it really is going to be a matter of you're going to have to get your reference out, be taking a look at that, and then trying to build up these shapes based off of the reference that you're going to have. This. And then now you have some tools at your disposal, at least geometry-wise, where you can be a little more free in trying out different ideas, different forms, and not sitting there worrying about, am I stretching the model out too far? It doesn't matter with Dynamesh. You're just worried about taking that shape and getting the shape, and the technical things, the topology stuff, you just worry about that later. And we'll be looking at different videos that I'll show you that deals with fixing the topology or making good topology that can be used for animation and stuff like that. But this is definitely a process. So I enjoy this stage the most, where you really are just sculpting right now. You're not really too worried about the technical things. And I know you are just learning about Dynamesh, but once you get past the whole, okay, just hold down Control and drag and remesh, once you get that thing down, which shouldn't take very long, you basically have a whole arsenal of digital clay that you can do anything you want and push and pull it into any kind of shape that you're looking for. And I'll even take this, I want to make more of a recess here in the neck. So you can see just by cutting this thing away and then remeshing, I really am starting to affect the shape of that quite a bit, of the shape of the actual like geometry that I'm using. And if I need to, I could even maybe use the standard brush. And here's where I find this thing handy. If I hold down Alt and dig into it, just make sure I'm hitting the bottom of that, I could really make a nice hole in there, and then I'll just remesh. Oops. Meant to hold down Alt. So you can see I'm really kind of carving away with that, and maybe switch it back to the Damien standard brush and keep carving away. Maybe build up that ridge. Put on the move tool. So once you get pretty familiar with the hotkeys and these different brushes and the whole Dynamesh process, these things will just keep speeding up for you quite a bit, and you'll not really be thinking about the computer too much, and you'll just be thinking more about what you want to make as far as a sculpture goes, which is very refreshing when you're using the computer. That's one of the reasons why I love ZBrush so much, because this does feel more like a traditional art process at this stage, where I'm not really worried about so much technical things, and I'm just worried about making art. Okay, as you progress in your sculpture, you might notice that at this resolution that we have, that you don't have quite enough polygons to work with. So my suggestion is to work the surface as much as you possibly can, and then once you notice that, okay, maybe I'm not ready for this next kind of detail phase, and I'm ready to start adding some of this finer kind of wrinkles and things like that, that's your sign to kind of pump this up a little bit more. And I notice with Dynamesh, it wants you to do some kind of change to the model, so I can just lightly tap on it and draw something or smooth some part out, and then remesh, and it'll go through this process. And as you get more resolution in there, it takes a little bit longer for it to remesh. But you can see now we've got this kind of detail level going on, and you might want to just quickly smooth out the model. So you can see we've got that new geo to work with. I can smooth out some of these shapes, and then now whenever I start to sculpt, you can see this is the kind of detail that I'm going to get with this brush at this point. So if this isn't enough still, I would keep working like at this level and try to get this to look, the best that it possibly can here. So this is even, some mid-size wrinkles and things like that. Get things working at this level, and then after you've kind of hit a wall with this detail and this phase, then it's time for you to pump up the Dynamesh resolution even more for the next phase. So I think you really should be working in stages. Like, you might have this thought, why not just crank it all the way up and then go to town on it, and you wouldn't have to worry about this resolution slider. It is possible. I just think it just makes it a little bit more difficult to hit certain shapes and kind of deal with the geometry that you're working with and the shapes, and it just makes the tools seem to work a little bit easier in my mind if you are kind of working in these methodical kind of stages, or if you're really kind of thinking about the detail passes that you're doing on something. It really kind of helps out for things. Just like if I wanted to add this in here, this shape, and if I was doing this at a higher level, it might be a little bit more difficult for me to kind of hit some of this inside of here and smooth it out and do it pretty quickly. You could do it, it's just the ease of use, I think, is where it's at. And if you build up in these stages, I think you'll you'll be doing yourself a favor. The other thing is if you have too much geometry, you might be painting a lot of like really fine kind of wrinkles and stuff like that in this area, and then all of a sudden you want to make this choice where you're like, okay, well, I want to build up the surface in a certain way, and then you kind of have destroyed some of the work that you've done. So you really want to kind of work in a specific way to where you get that shape. In my mind, everything's about shape, everything's about making sure you have proportions right, things like that. You might be laughing because this thing's way out of proportion, but I think you understand the idea of it. You want to make sure that everything's solidified first at the beginning stages, and then whatever you add on top of it after that will just be kind of icing on the cake. Okay, so that's how you're going to be able to use Dynamesh and then be able to kind of work and add more resolution. You can see if I remesh, let's see how this holds up. Make sure that everything looks good. So it got a little muddy, so I just hit undo on that, and I'll pump this up even higher. So I'll do like 450 for Dynamesh now. Then just put some kind of stroke on here. Like I said, you can just kind of smooth this real lightly and then remesh. And basically what I'm looking for is adding more resolution to this. I don't want to see any kind of change or any kind of loss of detail that I've sculpted. So that looks pretty good. And then now I should have a little bit more resolution to play with, so I can smooth some of this out. And then I can really get in here. Oops, I want to use the Deviant Standard brush. Now I can really get in here and get even finer with those wrinkles that I'm painting up. But again, if you don't have that form there to begin with, at the very beginning stages, all this extra little frill stuff just doesn't really matter, because it'll be a lot of really nice detail on bad anatomy and bad proportions and stuff like that. So there you go. There's how you can effectively use Dynamesh, add more geometry to it, and then get finer and finer results as you sculpt to get that final buildup of that final look that you're going for.